Good afternoon, welcome. So I'm your last session between now and happy hour and the keynote. So we'll keep it on time, but we'll keep it exciting. That's my philosophy. So today we're going to talk about security and privacy and the impacts to data and what does that mean for the data that you all are using in your organizations. So a little bit about me. I travel all around the country and internationally and speak at conferences like this all over on data privacy. I help with industry standards. I'm a professor. I do lots of things. So if you've seen me out on the internet, my stuff's all over. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if there's something that's of interest to you. But yeah, I'm pretty active in the security and privacy space. So the first thing I like to start with is what's the difference between security and privacy? Because this is often something that's misunderstood or confused. People think security is privacy and vice versa, and they're not. So when we talk about security, we're talking about the systems, the network, the infrastructure that holds the data. And privacy is those protections around the data itself and who can have access to that information. Who should have access to that? Because who can and who should are two different questions. So that's what we're going to be talking about today is the security and privacy of data that you all are working with in your organizations. So, question. What do you think is the most valuable asset in your organization? Any guesses? What did you? The data is actually, usually people is the question that I get, and that's not actually the right answer, but yes, data is the most valuable asset. And this is an older statistic from 2020. I've been using this one. And it says by the year 2025 that data will be the most valuable asset. So it's April 24. So we already hit this milestone far in advance before that date has even occurred. Now, this next slide is one that I always find interesting because this one talks about how organizations aren't doing their due diligence to protect that or understand the value that that data brings to their organization. So though data is the most important and the most valuable, what do we do with it? Where do we share it and how do we protect it? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about data privacy, I started my career off as a software developer over 20 years ago. And when I started off as a developer, we were writing software applications. There was about 20 to 25 things that we'd say was personal information. Name, address, phone number, passport, things like that. Driver's license. There was about 20, 25 core things that you could say, this is personal information. Nowadays, the definition of personal information based on the privacy laws has expanded exponentially. And it's anything that you can relate directly back to a living individual. And if you do international business, some of the international laws even have included deceased individuals as their definition of personal information. So who are they? What are they? Where do they reside? What do they do? Anything that you can relate back, or if you even have a combination of data elements. So maybe Dr. McKee by itself doesn't get you to me, but me, Dr. McKee in Nebraska, because I'm from Nebraska, now that gets you closer to who I am as a specific person. So that's what we're talking about. And this represents some of the categories: financial services, education, health records, so anything that you can think of that might get you back to an individual, that's what we're talking about. There's data all across the organization. And people don't always think about the outliers. So data in HR systems, applications, benefits, payroll. If you do expense reports, those systems have personal information that typically don't get evaluated because they're not one of the core systems. When we talk about software development and audits, audit departments have lots of personal information because they have to collect all that evidence to verify and validate what controls are in place and that the business is doing what it says it has to do, so it has to collect that information. So there's data all across the organization. Another big one is marketing. And we see a lot of issues coming up right now with marketing and privacy because there's a lot of reasons, or there's a lot of rules around what marketing can do with that personal information, who you can market to, who you can directly contact versus indirectly contact, consent. We're going to talk about that, and it comes down to those consent laws, and then opting out. So if you're not keeping track of all of that, that can get you into trouble rather quickly. And so marketing and ad tech is a big place where we see a lot of privacy violations. So why is data the most important, and why do we care? So the reason why this is becoming a big topic, or bigger than what it's been, is we have the privacy laws now that we have more and more that are coming out. But it comes down to the attackers want the information for their personal gain. It's harm to the individual of the information they have. It's harm to your business and your organization. It's a disruptor. And it's also monetary gain for them. So what we're going to talk about today is how do we protect the information and some things to consider. Have any of you heard of the OSINT framework? Okay, so one person. So I love to share this because I always like to share new things. So if you've never done an internet search on yourself, I would highly recommend, it's your homework, go do an internet search on yourself. So this is open source intelligence, is what OSINT stands for. This is what the bad guys are doing to get access to our information. And they're using freely available information that's on social media, that's on those address websites, click here, get criminal background checks, you name it, places you probably didn't even know your information was. They're using that information then against us. And they're using that against our businesses. So y'all heard the MGM data breach that happened back in August. This is how the attackers got into that environment, is they used OSINT and LinkedIn data to target lower level employees to get information that they shouldn't have gotten, but we as humans, we want to be helpful, we want to be friendly and share data, and that's exactly what happened. And in long story short, then they gained full access to MGM, and we all know that didn't end well. So different common attack methods of how they're getting that information. So we know there's phishing emails, business email compromise. They're attacking our networks, our servers. So not only is it the systems, right? We talk about security being the security of the systems and applications, but you are all targets as well. And as data and analytics and AI, you have a lot of information that you may not realize these attackers want. So we're going to talk about some of the business concerns with that. So as data becomes more and more within organizations and exponentially just growing, you have more privacy obligations, security obligations, more laws and regs that are constantly coming down, laws and regs on the books that are being updated, complying with those obligations. So unless you have somebody within your organization that's monitoring for those changes, being aware of what those are, and then being compliant with those is really causing some issues for organizations. And we're going to break that down. So the first thing with the security side is vendors. What data are you sharing with your vendors, with third parties? Where is that data going? Do you restrict the flow of data in your contracts? So one of my past jobs that I had, I reviewed contracts for third parties. And there was no restriction of data of where that data could go. But we, as the organization collecting it, we had obligations to keep the data in certain regions. So if you're not extending that in your contract, then now you're out of compliance because your third party is sending it further on down the line, and you're still obligated to protect that data, and you're responsible for it, even if they're not compliant. Same goes for access to information, encryption, protecting the data, and then where is the data stored? Not just where is it transmitted, but where is it stored and shared? Who owns the information? That's another thing that I saw in a contract too, where we collected the information, so we were the primary owners of it, but the contract said that the third party was also an owner of the data. That's going to cause a lot of issues. Because as third parties, they should only be doing and acting on that data per the contract. And if you give them full disclosure to do whatever, you're liable because you were the initial collection point. So make sure that you understand not just doing the security due diligence reviews, which is pretty standard and typical that businesses have been doing for years, but now we have to include those privacy obligations and look at things a little bit further of where that data is going and who's accessing it and where's it being stored. So have you heard of a roles and responsibilities matrix? Couple? So this is very important. I always recommend that it's in the contracts. After the contract is signed is a little too late, because when stuff happens and stuff blows up, and we know that it does quite frequently, that's when the finger pointing happens and then it's too late. So you always want to get things documented, clearly documented, line item by line item, who's responsible for what, have it as part of the contract with stipulations, SLAs, and other things, so that way, after the fact, you're not sitting there finger pointing and trying to figure out whose problem it is to fix. So compliance is one of my favorite things to talk about because I think it's one of the hardest jobs out there. So I've done a lot of compliance in my career, and compliance is that role that has to know everything. I'm not a lawyer, full disclosure, I am not a lawyer, but I know a lot about laws and regs because as compliance, you have to have the answer. When the business comes to you and says, well, what's this requirement in this law or reg mean? You have to help them and you have to understand what does that mean. There is no pass it off to somebody else. So when we talk about compliance, making sure that we understand what are the regulatory changes that are coming down. So the SEC's made some changes recently, NYDFS, if you have to comply with the New York Data Financial Services. CMM came out with new updates to their maturity model. So there's constant changes to these compliance obligations. So who within your organization is monitoring that? And then who's reading them for nuances like this one? So this is the Illinois biometric law. It's been out, I think, for about 10-ish years. It's not new. It's been around for quite a while, but it explicitly says that you cannot store biometric information longer than 3 years. 3 years. Now think about your data retention policies. Do they call out exemptions for biometrics? And then what is that time period? Because most don't do that. And usually the standard is 5 to 7 years, depending on what it is. Usually you don't see 3. So there's nuances in all these laws that are out there that organizations and businesses need to make sure that they understand so that you're complying with that, so that the data that you have, you can identify that and remove it when those retention periods have happened. So right now in the United States, as of, I think it was last week, the 11th of April, Nebraska, that's where I'm from, actually came the 17th state to pass privacy legislation. So in 2020, we had 1, it was California. In 22, we had 2. Or 21, we had 2, 22, we had 2. Last year, we had 5. So we ended the year with 12. Now we're already up to 14. Just in the first quarter this year alone, we've had 4 states pass privacy laws. So I tell people that privacy laws, it's like a data breach. It's not a matter of if, but when the laws are coming. So my state where I'm from in Nebraska, this was their 3rd attempt at passing privacy laws before they finally were able to get it through the full process and everybody's approval. So even if you see states like Michigan, y'all here, it's still going through the process. It's gone through the process a couple of times. The ones that are in darker gray are ones that tried this year, but then the bill died. Georgia has tried a couple of times. There's some others that have tried a couple of times as well. So they're going to keep trying, and it's going to keep coming, and it's going to keep coming, and eventually this whole thing's going to be green. Now, when that's going to happen, I don't know. I would say probably 26 by the trajectory that we're on. That's just my rough guess. We also had a national privacy laws that was recently proposed. And I've been hearing some promising things on that. We'll see how that goes, but it does have bipartisan support. So the exciting part about that is even if you're in a state that's not green on this map, that still affords you some of the same privacy rights as people that are in the states that are green, that have those laws. And not only are there the state privacy laws, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. So you've got FERPA, you've got HIPAA, you've got others. And then how do you manage all of that? So you all just want to do your job. Be like, this is what I do. Do some data stuff. I run some reports. Let me just get about my day. And then things like this keep popping up of, oh, but you can do this here, but you can't do that there. And and now it starts to get really complicated and complex with the compliance obligations. Colorado was probably the craziest one that I saw. That one passed in 2014, so 10 years old. And their law says that they actually have to disclose all third parties this is for education, on the school's website with all the data that the school collects on students. Now, most don't even know what they have at all, let alone to get that from third parties. And then, do you really want to share all that? But if you don't, then there's a long process, and at the end of the day, if you don't follow the process and the AG determines that the school didn't follow the process, you as the third party could lose the right to do business in the entire state. That could be detrimental to any business, to not be able to do in a specific state. So there are some really crazy laws out there, some really stringent ones that we don't even know about, because that's not our purview as data and analytics. Any of you do global? So a couple. So I do a lot of work with global companies, large global companies. Right now, 85% of the countries in the world have some version of data privacy laws. 85. So there's 192 countries and 85% of them. So that's even more than what we're at here in the US. So not only do you now have to worry about each and every little state that has its own laws, but now you have to worry about each country in which you do business or have customers. And this is why I say compliance is one of the most hardest jobs, because trying to track and manage that is not easy. So data. When we talk about the privacy obligations, it has a huge impact on the data that businesses have. So up here is 4 of the core privacy rights that are in every law, both here in the US and internationally. And the first one is the right to access. And what that means is that people that live in those states that were green have the right to go to another business and say, I want to know what information you have on me. Now think about that for a minute. Could you respond to a request if somebody said, what information do you have on me? That's every system, every email, every blah, blah, blah across your network. Now, that's hard in and of itself. If you're in the US, you have 45 days to respond to those. The EU, it's 30, and if you happen to do business in Brazil, Brazil's the one that I found to be the most stringent, it's 15 days, 2 weeks. Yeah, you laugh, but it's true, that's their law. It is terrifying, extremely terrifying, yes. Yes, I mean, 45 days is bad enough as it is, right? And then we've got these data lakes and all this data floating everywhere and shared everywhere, and how do we comply? So the next one that's up here is the disclosure. So you've all seen the pop-ups on the websites and the cookie notices. Those are the disclosures to say this is the information that we collect. Here's who we share it with. This is what we do with it, the processing that happens with that data. That is another requirement under all the privacy laws. And that's why you started seeing all the pop-ups and all the cookies that have been on websites. How many of you read those? Not a person? Okay, more homework. Just read one. Just read one. You would be floored at what you would see in those. I went to a clinic back home, and I was in person, And we all know you go get treated at the clinic. Oh, sign here for consent to treat. And you're also consenting that you got the privacy policy. And I'm like, well, where's that? Oh, well, it's in this no. So you're consenting to something that they didn't even give you. And I'm like, no, so you can give that to me, and then I will sign that I received it. And when I got the privacy notice and I started reading more, they were sharing my information for research. They were doing other things with my data that I did not agree with. And so I actually went through and signed the boxes that I was okay with and declined the ones that I wasn't. But all of that, I mean, the document was probably 6 pages. And all it was, here, sign this little box for consent to treat. They're putting a ton of things in these disclosures that we don't even know about. You have the right to ask. And if it says you received something, ask for it. And don't be ashamed about that. Be proud. Be like, I want that, and I'll sign it when I get it. Because a lot of times they don't have it. It's like, give me 10 minutes and I'll go find somebody that does and I'll be back. I've had that happen many times. The same as on the pop-ups, the cookies, and the banners that we see. You can actually shut those off. So that's why I say read them. You'll be surprised what's in them. But you also have the right to shut those cookies off. So strictly necessary cookies are what's necessary for the website to run. But all the other stuff is optional. If you want it to do those things because it enhances your use of the website, pre-fills data and things like that, certainly leave them on. But if you're somebody like me that's like, nope, just give me the bare minimum, you do have, in most cases, the opportunity to shut those off. So if you've never looked at those disclosures that pop up, I would highly recommend that because you'd be very surprised some of the things that are in them. The opt-out is another one. You have the right to opt out of marketing, opt out of certain processing of your information. And so then if we think about that, how do we keep track of that? So I emailed, 200 people for marketing, and 10 came back and said, I want to opt out. Now somewhere I have to keep track of that. And then when the system updates, because they all update, now that just got overwritten with the fresh set of information, so now I no longer have that opt-out choice. Some businesses are running into issues with that. So how do you keep track of that when they say, oh, I want to opt out, and then you get new information that's constantly coming in? You have to make sure you're not overwriting those old records. And then the right to deletion. So not only can they say, what information do you have on me, they can request that information get updated if it's incorrect, and they also have the right to say, delete my data. Now, if somebody comes and says, delete my information, that does not mean you have to delete everything. And the reason why I say that is because there are businesses, we just saw a whole bunch of laws up on the screen, that there's all these compliance obligations, and some of them, especially financial services, you're required to keep some of that information for a certain period of time. Different types of transactions or actions, lawsuits and things like that, you're required to keep, in some cases, indefinitely. So that's where it's important that you have accurate retention policies. When you get those requests, then you can say, we've deleted the data that we can based on a retention policy. We'll delete the rest of it, when it meets its retention. Those are adequate responses. Because this one gets people frightened, thinking I literally have to delete everything, and it's within your compliance obligations. So I pulled this one just to put this into a little bit more impact, just to wrap your hands around it a little bit more. So this is the Iowa state law that passed in 2023. It's not effective until January. But this says that the Attorney General does the enforcement, and civil penalties are up to $7,500 per violation. So that's a record, potentially. Now think of all the data that your organization has. Some of these can get very expensive, and in some cases to the point where businesses are just no longer. So it's important to understand each of the state laws that you do business in. They're all different. How they prosecute is different. Who has ultimate responsibility varies. Most of the cases, it's the Attorney General, but there are some nuances. CPRA enforcement. So I thought this would be fun to share. So there's 3. So DoorDash was fined $375,000 for selling personal data without consent. Google, $93 million for location data and improper use of location information. That's personal information, your geolocation on your phone, your IP addresses on your mobile devices. You can get back to an individual and a location. And then the last one I put up here is Kaiser was $49 million for improper, unlawful disposal of PHI, protected health information. So there's a website out there, and if you want a copy of the slides, I can certainly share these with you, but California has an enforcement tracker. GDPR, if you do business in other countries, they have enforcement trackers. They're actually rather enlightening to go out and see, well, what are they concerned about with other companies? Where are other companies getting in trouble? And then looking at that internally within your organization to make sure that that's not something that will get you into trouble as well. Yeah, so this is not intended to be small, to be funny. This is what I call a compliance footprint. So does anybody have a list of laws, regs, standards that apply to your organization that's fully documented? Yeah, not a person. That's typically what I see. And so one of the first things that I start with, this is what I call a compliance footprint, which is a list of all your compliance obligations. How can you be compliant with something that you don't know you have to comply with or that applies to your business? You can't. And then if the compliance people are telling tech or others across the business you have to do something, well, who says I have to do that? So having this documented, having this approved and signed off by legal is really important because it makes those compliance obligations a lot easier to enforce and get support when you're making those changes across the organization. So this is actually the compliance footprint of a global company that I worked for. And I was in charge of compliance, and this is what I had to manage. And actually, that's not even everything. So it's very possible that this is what it looks like for your company. Do you feel like your day is a dumpster fire? I know I do quite frequently, right? It's always something, laws are changing, new things are coming out, business says I can't do something. So how do we manage it all? What's that? It is a whole nother, yes, whole nother level of dumpster fire, for sure, for sure. So some of the security and privacy controls, we're going to shift into, what do we do about this? Like, how can we ensure that the data that we have, we're protecting, that we're compliant, we're doing our due diligence as good data stewards of the data and information that we have. So when we look at network infrastructure, if you're in the cloud, what does your cloud tenant look like? Is it a dedicated environment? Is it a shared environment or multi-tenant? Some people don't even know what those mean or don't know what theirs is. So multi-tenant means that your data is commingled with other customers' data for that vendor or that third party, which may be okay. You may have a reason that you have to have your own, but does your contract stipulate that? Who has ownership of hardware? Where is the data going? Ownership of the data, protections of the data. So looking at all of that when we look at network architecture, network diagrams, data flow diagrams, is that all documented? So asset inventory, this is a security control that we've been doing for quite some time. Companies still struggle with this. They don't always have an accurate asset inventory, or they think it's just the core systems. The data lakes, the databases, the servers, the network equipment. It should be everything. Laptops have lots of information. They can be compromised just as equally as something else, if not more so. So making sure that we have all of that information listed and then know the location of those. So if you're doing business with a company that says my data has to stay in the US, and you've got an employee that travels outside of the country or physically resides outside of the country, what does their access to that data look like? Can they download it to their local workstation? Are they remote into a workstation that just stays there, that they can't then traverse those environments? Things to consider. When we look at access management, it's not just physical and logical access, but also what's the legitimate interest to have access to that. So legitimate interest is one of those things that is really important under the privacy laws. It's not just because I'm marketing, I should have access to something. So unless you have a legitimate need to have access to data, the privacy laws say, no, you can't have access. Events like today. Just because we're all here doesn't mean I get access to all your all's information. Now, if we share information, that's different. You gave consent, I gave my consent to give you my information, that's entirely different. But if your sales team comes here and they have a list of attendees, they can't just share it with others within the business because they're like, hey, I want to know too, and maybe I want to reach out to them. That doesn't always meet the legitimate interest clause. So making sure that we understand when we share information, do we have a right to share? And are we doing it within the confines of the law? Security controls, these are pretty standard. The biggest thing is encryption, making sure that when data is transmitted and shared that it's protected, encrypted in some way, shape, or form. I threw this slide in here because it's a data and analytics conference. So when we talk about data modeling, right, that's a big part of what data analysts do. So when you're training models, the laws say that, several of the laws say you cannot use real personal information to train the models. So then what data are you using? How are you ensuring that the fake data that you're using to train these models are as close to real information as you can get without it being real information so that you're still within the confines of the law, but able to train your model and serve the purpose that you need to? We talk about reporting and analytics. That comes back to what I was just talking about with access, the legitimate interests. You all are doing reports all the time and analytics on the data all the time. That's part of what data analysts do, and data stewardship comes down to where do you share that, and then goes back to the legitimate interest. Just because somebody over in some other team asks for a report or asks for access doesn't mean that it's appropriate. And depending on what your role is within the organization, then it's going to depend on who you need to have involved in that conversation to educate people. Because you're not saying no to not be nice. We all want to be helpful, but you definitely don't want to get in trouble with some of the laws in doing so. So ChatGPT, when we talk about emerging technologies, ChatGPT and the emerging technologies in AI, they can be great resources for businesses. But making sure that you have policies and procedures in place on what's appropriate and what can be done. And also making sure that whatever data you're getting out of those tools, that you're doing some sort of validation on that. So this is a question that a student of mine asked Chat. It says, create a reference page with scholarly articles for privacy and biometrics. And that's what that FAR diagram is. And when you look at it, it looks legit. It's got DOI numbers, it's got dates, everything looks real, you wouldn't second guess it. And the next question in this red box, it says, are these articles real? And it says, well, as an AI tool, I can't guarantee that they're real. I don't have access to that information. So we use these tools, but do we validate that the information that we're getting is correct? Or do we just take their word for it? Same goes for other AI tools with neural networks and machine learning. As you're training your models and using these other tools and doing automated data processing and decision making, there's laws and rules against that too. What's the impact to the individual based on the decisions that are being made? Do you have alternate processes in place? So the biggest thing that I wanted to call out here with risk and governance was the retention policies. We talked about retention policies, making sure everything's documented, and then within the confines of the different types of data that you have. So biometrics is sensitive data, so there's going to be different retention policies on that than maybe some other things. So retention policies can actually get quite complicated. And people don't always realize that. They're like, oh, there should only be a few things. No, we have all these laws and regs and all this data, and we have to consider all of that. Different risk assessments. This is another requirement that we see in the privacy laws, is the requirement to do privacy risk assessments. So looking across the entire organization, the data and everything else. Privacy controls with consent. We talked about that with the opting in. Did they explicitly give you consent, or did you assume based on other activities and other actions that it's okay? So there's a difference between direct implicit consent and implied consent. So making sure that you understand that, because the US is an opt-out, meaning you're automatically opted in unless you explicitly say, no, I don't want you to do that with my information, whereas the EU is the opposite. You have to say, I want in. So the biggest piece of advice is to stop, think, and then respond. So before you post something, before you share something, before you store it somewhere on a file share, run a report, is it appropriate? Do you have the authority to do that? Do you have the legitimate interests? Consent, think about all the things around that, and then proceed where it's appropriate. Because there's a lot of times we'll stop and we'll think about it and they'll go, well, maybe I'm not supposed to share it with somebody. But we just get so busy in the day-to-day that we don't always stop and think about what we're doing and then go, wait. So this is a data management strategy that I wanted to do with, of how you can start to structure your data plan with understanding the data that you have, your data governance, access controls. And so this will be helpful in data classification and tagging as well. And then making sure that you have buy-in from the entire organization when you're having these conversations. So ComPRSec, compliance, security, privacy, probably legal as well. It's not just a one person that has all the answers. So I talk about a top-down, bottom-up approach, and let's meet in the middle. Because our frontline workers and our analysts are doing things that are different than our managers and our executives even know that they're doing. So they're pushing orders down. The frontline's just trying to do what they're doing. So let's bring everybody together and have the conversations together instead of just messaging being pushed down. Or you're trying to push something up that middle management says, oh, I don't think that's important to keep pushing up the chain. Is that really your decision to make? So that's why I think it's important to do a top-down, bottom-up, and let's all have this conversation together. So steps that you can take within your organization is knowing where your data is, where your data is going, how that data is protected, where it's shared, and then conducting diligence and oversight of that information. More steps to protect. Does anyone use like DuckDuckGo or some of the privacy-aware browsers? So a few of you. DuckDuckGo, there's a couple others. Brave is another one. They don't do the cookies and stuff like others do, so there are some trade-offs, but that's one thing. And then taking this step by step. So everything that we learned today, and how can you take it back to your organization and apply it? So understanding your inventory of information, understanding your compliance obligations, mapping out your data across the organization, and then having a strategy around who can have access to that, where does that access, where does that data go, who can it be shared with? And then at the very end, once you've got your plan in place and your strategy is executed, then you just monitor for changes. Changes to access, or changes to data collection, or changes to laws and regs. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'll open up if there's any questions. We have a few minutes for questions.
in these circumstances where compliance has actually improved business outcomes for companies in the past, where that might happen, going forward today?
Yeah, so the question is, has compliance improved organizations? We know it definitely makes it more complicated. And I would say the answer is yes. And this is one of the strategies that I talk about with the businesses that we work with, is it's the customer trust. So if you go if you even put it on your website, we do these compliance things, these are the laws and regs that we meet and maintain, you're openly sharing that information. You're showing that you care, you're sharing due diligence, and now you're instilling trust and confidence within your customers. And it's kind of the, if you do it, they will come. That's exactly what we've seen the results of that. It's the ones that get in trouble, that try to hide that then are the ones, that struggle with it the most. So yeah, we have seen some benefits of it for sure. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, well, if you want a copy of the slides, just let me know. If you have any other questions, I'll be around. Otherwise, enjoy the keynote and cocktails later.